Welcome to another edition of a walk through Philippians. Today we will be looking at Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14. And we're in an incredible passage where Paul is calling for a response after presenting this incredible exalted picture of Jesus. And he calls us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. And the reason he gives us why we should do this and how we do it is because God is working in us both to will and to work according to his good purpose. That was verse 13 last time. Now we dive into a passage that talks about us living as light in amongst darkness. It talks about how we outwork our salvation as saints. So we're going to be looking at verse 14 on this episode, then 15 next time, and 16 the time after. And we're going to be looking first at what we are supposed to do in outworking our salvation. Paul selects something, in a sense, he picks a fruit off the tree and says, this is what a fruit of outworking your salvation looks like. And then he goes on to speak about why we should live out this way, why this fruit, if you can call it that, is so important, and then how it is outworked. And so let's just dive in today, looking at Philippians chapter 2, and we'll just read verse 14 to 16 and take it one verse at a time together. Do everything without grumbling and arguing, verse 14, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world, by holding firm to the word of life. Then I can boast in the day of Christ that I didn't run or labor for nothing. So today we're just really going to hone in on this: do everything without grumbling and arguing. What an interesting fruit that he chooses to pick off the tree of outworking our salvation with fear and trembling. He makes this incredible statement of how what we are to, how we are to respond as Christians to this incredible picture of Jesus. And then he goes and he chooses this thing: do everything without grumbling and arguing. It's quite interesting how he straight away begins with do everything. And I think we must remember, it's so important to remember that the outworking of our salvation, the working out of our faith requires doing. If we are not doing, we have missed something, and we're not correctly or adequately outworking our faith. He dives straight into it here. He says, there's an element of urgency, there's an importance, there's a forcefulness even with which he is calling us to respond to this. He says, do everything without grumbling and arguing. So when he says everything, is that perhaps everything on a Tuesday, everything maybe that you do on a Sunday morning when you're at church? No, everything is everything. It's a very inclusive word. It talks holistically about our life, about our thoughts, our inclinations, our attitudes, our actions, our words. Everything from when we rise in the morning to when we go to sleep at night. There is an entirety in this word, everything. Do everything, he says, without grumbling or arguing. And when he says do everything without grumbling or arguing, he's setting quite an incredible standard. He's saying everything, yes, everything, without. And that without, he's saying without a trace, without even a taste, without even a hint of it. You know, some people perhaps might be vegetarians, and they don't want you to cook some meat in a pot and then cook their vegetables straight after that, because there's a hint of flavor remaining, there's a smell remaining, there's perhaps even bits of little pieces of meat left behind. So they don't want that. They would want that if you were cooking them a vegetarian dish, it should have no trace of meat in it. And in the same way, Paul is saying, do everything without grumbling or arguing. And this is without any trace in what we say and what we do, but it's in any internal trace as well. He's piercing right through to our heart attitudes and uh, our thinking and what happens inside us. It's such an important thing to see this, because actually grumbling and arguing very often begins inside the heart. It doesn't just come out of empty space, but it comes from the heart. Jesus said, "You aren't clean by what you put in your made unclean by what you put in your mouth, but what comes out of your mouth." Why does he say that? It's because it reveals what's in your heart. And so Paul is addressing even the heart here. He's saying, do everything without grumbling and arguing. And this really is first and foremost a heart attitude, and first and foremost a heart attitude towards God. Jeremiah Burroughs preached a message called The Evils of a Murmuring Spirit. And there he says, this kind of grumbling is as rebellion to God. This kind of grumbling, this grumbling, it's a moaning, it's a murmuring kind of heart attitude that we have, that sometimes indecipherable, even we can't even make out what's being said, but it's just this heart attitude of discontentment pointed towards God. And we remember the Israelites demonstrating something of this. As soon as we see the grumbling and arguing, it reminds me certainly of the Israelites and the grumbling they're grumbling before the Lord in the wilderness. We see in Exodus 16 this moment where they were grumbling about the food they had and the water they had, and they were grumbling. And Moses said, "You're not grumbling against us, but you are grumbling against the Lord." There's a kind of rebellious attitude in our grumbling, in our discontentment, in situations and in places. See this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and we'll read from verse 10. It says, "Don't grumble as some of them did." This is talking about the Israelites, "and were killed by the destroyer." Verse 11 says, "These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." Isn't that amazing? These things were written as instruction for us. The faults of the Israelite people as they wandered through the wilderness were examples and instructions for you and I and how to live our life today. Let us not grumble as some of them did, were killed by the destroyer. What a terrifying thing. There's this kind of discontentment we can carry with God. We have been made right with God in Jesus Christ. And so there is a peace that we can enjoy and should experience as we walk with God. It's a humbling ourselves, as in 1 Peter chapter 5, it says, "Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God." And there's a reality that we must live with and walk with in that way, that we don't become those who grumble and argue, because this starts with this hot attitude of discontentment towards God. Oh, why is this the way it is? Why is that the way it is? Why can't I have this or have that? Or why must I be like this? Or why must it be like that? We need to humble ourselves and submit ourselves to God. James chapter 4 speaks about a hot attitude of submission to Christ, recognizing his rule and reign and his authority in our life and over our lives. And it speaks into it in a beautiful way. Let's look at that quickly. "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, I will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be, for you are like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." So let us not be those who boast, who have this prideful heart of wanting to take control of life and wanting to decide or determine how things should be, because that results in a hardness towards God, a a resistance towards God. And when we are discontent in our hearts, when we are grumbling in our hearts towards God, often that flows out and outworks in many kinds of arguments with people and even with God. Second Timothy, Paul warns Timothy um, uh, arguing. He says, reject foolish and ignorant disputes, because you know they breed quarrels. The Lord's servant must not quarrel. Now, he's speaking to Timothy as a leader, but this instruction really is for all of us. We must avoid and reject foolish and ignorant disputes. How many foolish and ignorant disputes are flooding social media even today? We need to reject those, turn away from them, resist them, and submit ourselves to God in a holy submission that's then with a submitted heart to God, um, resists the urge to engage in quarreling and in disputing and in arguing. And so we will look next time at why we should be resisting this kind of grumbling and arguing, and then we will look at how we do this. But for now, it's so important for us to remember that we are directly and clearly instructed to resist this, to resist grumbling and arguing, to flee from it, and to turn away from it, even in our heart attitudes. And we must apply this in our life and in every way. God bless you. We'll see you next time.